So if you would turn with me to the book of Romans, Romans chapter 1. We're just going to break a few verses down here in Romans and see how far we get tonight. So being that this was on a little bit of short notice, I encourage all the input and questions comments you can have. Maybe not so many questions, but comments would be great. Let's start in verse 18. Romans chapter 1, we'll start in verse 18. We'll go a couple verses at a time and kind of break that down and pull some things out of these verses through the end of the chapter. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. Some of the things we're going to talk about tonight will tie back into the things we have been talking about in our Sunday morning lesson. But something that we talked about actually in some of the previous, the series that we did on what happens to me when I die, and talking about the judgment, and how there are some out there who like to think that God's wrath won't be actually that bad, won't be that wrathful. He's too loving, he's too kind, too merciful to actually be wrathful towards men. If we think back through time and history and all the evidence that we see in the Bible about God's wrath, think about the flood. His wrath was so great. He was sorry he'd made man. He destroyed mankind all but Noah and his family. Think about Sodom and Gomorrah on a large scale, and we'll refer back to that again later down in the chapter. But Sodom and Gomorrah, that he destroyed entire cities because of their wickedness and their sin. On a more personal note, you had Nadab and Abihu, who he struck dead. Ananias and Sapphira. Can you think of some others? Were there other instances where God's wrath took someone's life?
David's son.
Nadab and Abihu.
Nadab and Abihu. David's son, because of David's sin. Every time we see God's wrath enacted upon men to the point where he takes someone's life, it's because of sin on their part or someone else's. It's interesting that you mentioned David's son, because sometimes when someone dies, an innocent victim, we could say, dies, and people are angry at God. How could you let this happen? And we talked about this in a lesson maybe a month or so ago, that there are consequences of men's sin, and sometimes it's not the person who committed the sin that pays the price. You think about drunk driving. How many times does that take an innocent life? Not because of the sin of that person, but the sin of the person who caused the accident. And there's many other examples like that we could be aware of. But just the fact that people will try to say that God's wrath maybe won't be that bad, I wouldn't want to hang my hat on that. I'd be nervous living my life that way, thinking that his wrath won't be that bad. He goes on, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. We can know what God expects of us. That's why we're here tonight, just to make ourselves better aware of what God does expect of you and me, so that we don't have that wrath brought down upon us. That's the reason we want to understand his word well. But at the beginning of, or towards the end of verse 18, he talks about men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Can you think of any examples of that? How do men suppress the truth?
I think baptism is not for remission of sin.
That's a good example. Really, any kind of false teaching. There are so many religions today that build their belief system around what men want, and what makes men feel good. It makes them feel feel maybe uplifted and encouraged when they meet, and that's great, we should feel uplifted and encouraged, but when they fail to mention what sin is in this world, and maybe in their lives, because they want them to feel uplifted, they want them to keep coming back, coming in the door. So they just say the things that they want to hear. And in so doing, they are suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. We can see it in other places besides just in religion. And when you look at whether it's in the media, whether it's through governments, where they encourage things that we know to be sinful, but they act like they're okay. It's definitely evident in our entertainment today. How the things that God says are sinful, we'll talk about those a little more farther down, but the things that God says are sinful, our entertainment continually puts it in front of us as if it's just normal. It's okay. So that's some things to be mindful of. If we go on and read verses 20 and 21. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. There's probably not too many places in the world where you can be more aware of God's power in creation than where we live. And there's a lot of other beautiful places in the world, don't get me wrong. But we live in one where it's obvious every time you step outside God's power. When we see those things, when we see the beauty of His creation that's all around us every day, and it can be as simple as going out and sitting down in a grassy field and looking at the plants and the bugs and how everything works together perfectly in nature, to recognize His divine nature. He put that together by plan. It wasn't an accident, like some men will try to say that, as they try to teach evolution, well, this all happened by accident and over millions or billions of years. No, God planned this out, and it works perfectly. The only time it doesn't work perfectly is when we think we can improve on it.
We mess it up.
And we mess it up. We're pretty good at that. But even then, we can mess it up pretty severely, and give it enough time, it'll fix itself. It'll take care of itself, because He created it that way. Shows His power. But man thinks he's pretty smart. But it goes again, it says that we can know God. We did know God. But man chooses to ignore and not pay attention to things that we can know about God. It was interesting as I was thinking, putting these thoughts together this evening. I don't know if any of you have followed John Muir or any of his writings, and I don't know what his religious beliefs were, don't condone those, but he frequently went to the mountains, spent time in nature because that made him feel closer to God. And even to the point where he's known for climbing up in a tree to weather a storm with the tree to see what the tree went through. So there was one instance where he climbed 100 feet up into a tree and just held on while a pretty severe storm blew through. He said it was whipping the tree from side to side, and he just closed his eyes and listened. And he was probably one individual who really got to see or understand the power of God just because he spent time with God's creation in that way. But there are so many other ways we can be aware of God's power. That starts into verse 22 and 23, professing to be wise, they became fools. And we've talked about this a little bit in previous classes. I don't remember now if it was in
Corinthians.
Was it in Corinthians where we're talking about that? But professing to be wise, they became fools. And in comparison to God, our smartest individual is foolish compared to God. It says, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. How often does mankind put God into a box? Limit his power. We don't limit his power. We limit what we think his power, what he's capable of. We obviously can't limit his power, but we limit what we think he can do. Maybe we limit what we're willing to ask him for because we put the limits on it. Thinking we are so smart, as it says here, professing to be wise, they became fools. Does that still happen today? Or did it just happen back when Paul was writing to the Romans? Absolutely happens today.
I think a lot of times too, we, instead of putting God first in our problems, we use him as a last hope or last chance. You know, we're thinking, well, we'll deal with it ourselves when we go through all this stuff, instead of understanding his power needs to be put first.
Yeah. If I can't figure it out, then I'll call on him to help me if I can't get it
It should be the
figured
other way
out.
around.
Yeah, Josh.
It's kind of neat if you put this section you're reading here in the backdrop of the pagan culture he's writing this letter to. And, you know, he starts 17 about the righteous of God, the righteous will live by faith. Then he goes into contrast of the unrighteous. So here are these righteous people who are vexed like Lot, living in, you know, the unrighteous city of Rome, and they have to see all this unrighteousness, and they're overwhelmed by the unrighteousness. And he's reminding them the wrath of God is reserved for them.
Yeah.
And then he goes through and says they should have known, but they don't. And they think they're wise, and they're not. And you're in a right position. You're in a right relationship with God, even though you feel like you're the minority with all that unrighteousness around you. And here's what God has laid out for them, despite their ignorance, despite the fact that they had a chance to know who God is. And so that's his message to them in Rome, who are just, you know, perplexed on every side with this unrighteousness. And we can be in the same situation. It's like, man, when are things going to turn around? When are things going to be better? But we just keep doing what we know we need to do. And God's wrath will sort things out. You know, it mentions that wrath from heaven, the origin of those things, the righteousness of God. So I think it's neat to put that in the context of those who are trying to be righteous in a very unrighteous society.
Sure. Because we live in one.
Oh, yeah.
This definitely fits where we live. I think we also, as members of his church, sometimes we can have the tendency to look outside and point. So we need to remember to look inward and say, am I doing something am I professing to be wise? Oh, I've got this figured out. And meanwhile, I'm really missing it somewhere. And make sure that we're continually looking and searching the scriptures to make sure we're not missing something. But I think as he talks about here in verse 23, putting God into an image made like corruptible man. How often do we hear men refer to God as, God, he's my buddy, he's my friend. He loves me, but he's the creator of the universe. He's not my buddy. He's not, I shouldn't talk down to him in that way. Yes, I love him, but he is so much greater than mankind will ever be. We need to be careful that we give him the reverence that he deserves when we talk about God, and not be flippant in the way we refer to him. And man has a tendency to do that. Let's go ahead and read verses 24 and 25. It says, "Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lusts of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen." Pause there again. It's good that we note here that God allowed men to make his choice. And when it says God, in 24, God gave them up to uncleanness. Does that mean he was just okay with it now? No, it means it was in their heart. That's what they wanted. So he allowed it. God doesn't force our obedience. It has to be a choice. And it has to be man's choice to serve him and love him the way that he intended. We'll get into a little bit more of what he's talking about specifically in the next couple of verses. But there are some who will say, well, you know, God made me this way. God made me who I am. That's who, I'm the creature that he made. And as it talks here about serving the creature rather than the creator, it's when we're putting our wants, our desires above God's. I'm the created one. What authority do I have to tell the creator how I'm going to live? None. And we see so much
I have
today.
a question. Kind of following what you just said. So in the Garden of Eden, everything was perfect. Man was perfect. Woman was perfect. Everything was perfect. Sin came when sin happened. And now I have a hard time understanding or believing that God made me the way I am. It was because of sin. It was because of the pollution. It was because of uranium poisoning and this and this and this and all these millions of things, you know, that was put up on people because of sin. It's not the perfect world. And it's hard for me to understand when people say, well, God made me like that. I don't think that, for me, is the way that I believe that anymore, because I don't think God wanted this one girl to have two heads and one body. You know, cows have all of it, everything in the world is so not right, you know, I mean, everything. So it's hard for me to say God made me this way when sin came into the world, and because I came into the world as, you know, as a person, you know, I have that hard time to understand that, you know.
Yeah, it's difficult to see how people think that could be true, but there are people, and what they're wanting to do is serve self. They want to do what they want to do, and by saying, well, God made me this way, they somehow think that justifies what they want to do.
Yeah, it's like a cop-out.
And that's exactly what he's talking about here in verse 25. Man chose to serve the created, not the creator.
Right.
And a lot of that comes back to a lack of understanding. I guess we'll touch back on some of the first verses we read there in 20 and 21. Seeing his creation, understanding his creation, what's going on in our society at least, what do you think there is that's keeping people from seeing that? Understanding that thoroughly?
Not reading the Bible.
Right?
Selfishness.
Do you think some of the things in our society specifically that take up our time keep people from noticing God's creation? How many people spend their whole day looking at their phone or looking at their computer? They don't even go outside and see his creation. Not that you have to be outside to see or witness his creation, but it sure helps. And when people are so enveloped into their social media, their jobs, all these things that maybe some of which are not wrong in and of themselves, but they're so enveloped into those things, they're oblivious to God's creation. And do you think that's by accident from Satan's standpoint?
Yeah.
I think he knows what he's doing when he just keep us busy, keep us occupied so we don't take the time to study, we don't take the time just to appreciate God's creation and his strength and power. Therefore, from that, if Satan can keep us busy, he can keep us out of heaven. He doesn't have to make us a murderer or an adulterer. He just needs to keep us occupied and not distracted from God. That's all he's got to do. Lyle?
I've had some people from New York or somewhere in Pennsylvania and say, they just never got out of that blasted city
Yeah.
to see what God can do.
Yeah, it's sad. There's so many people that don't get to witness that.
And that.
All right, where did we leave off?
You're at 26.
26. Okay, let's read 26 and 27. It says, for this reason God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use of what is against nature, likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due. Now, this obviously could include many sexual immoralities, but it obviously includes homosexuality. It's very clear from these two verses that he's talking about homosexuality here, and so many in our society today want to talk about it as a lifestyle, or back to God made me that way.
God calls them dishonorable.
Yes, and he gave them over. Once again, he says he gave them over. This was what they wanted, so he allowed them to make that choice, because he does not force obedience. He gave them over, and he calls it, gave them up to vile passions. So if anyone truly believes in God, can they think God created them to commit vile passions and is okay with that? Going back to the very first verse we read, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. His wrath will be revealed on not just the individuals talked about here, but all sin. But this is the one he's talking about specifically, and I think back to Josh's point, in the culture that they were in, that was common in their society. At least the sexual immorality was common among some of the gods that would have been worshipped in certain cities, maybe not in Rome specifically, but certainly sexual immorality was part of their culture. We sometimes think, well, it's new.
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah, there's nothing new under the sun. When we talked about God's wrath and some different examples of how his wrath was brought down upon men for that specifically. And so this is just another place to keep in mind when you're talking to someone who wants to justify, and there are religions in our country today, maybe even in this town, that they say, well, we're accepting of everyone. If you're homosexual, that's okay. Well, we're accepting of everyone. Come in the door and hear what God has to say, but if you've got sin, you have to repent. You can't continue in that.
Well, and to Tawny's point, when we were getting into 28 and following down, that's going to answer your question.
Yeah.
Real clear.
Here's a question I'll throw out to the group. I don't know that I know the answer, but towards the end of verse 27, he said, "In receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due." I've heard it said that whether it be sexually transmitted diseases, I heard it specifically talked about when AIDS was kind of the thing in the news, that was what this verse is talking about. That they are receiving the penalty that was due them. I don't know how you could prove it one way or another that that's what that verse was talking about. And if it wasn't talking about that, then what penalty of their error is he talking about? Beyond eternal, yes. And is he talking about something that happened in this life physically? I don't know.
And it could be both.
And it could be both, yes.
Verse 24 talks about the fact that they received, their bodies would be dishonored among them in sin.
Yeah.
So there's that immediate context of the dishonoring and that unrighteousness that we're talking about.
Yes.
And I think we extrapolate and put things onto it later on, but
Yeah.
that would be the immediate context, like you're saying, as far as the sin and the wrath of God that comes upon those that practice those things.
And then 50 years ago, the dishonor, even in this country, would have been significant. Now, that has changed in many places, and I don't think for a second that Satan's not behind that, trying to make it less dishonorable within our society. Now, it's still not less dishonorable in God's eyes, and it shouldn't be in ours either, but in our society, Abby and I were talking about this the other day. I can remember some TV shows coming on when I was maybe early teens, that insinuated homosexuality. They It certainly wasn't blatant, but then wasn't too many years until there was homosexuality within TV shows, and then
Now it's on all.
now every TV show has homosexuality, and it's just a normal thing. And that gradual change goes unnoticed by many until now the mindset is, well, that's just normal. That's okay.
Little leaven.
Yes. Where if that'd been, 40, 50 years ago, there were so many that wouldn't even profess to be homosexual. If they had that tendency or urge, they wouldn't profess it or proclaim it because it was dishonorable. It was embarrassing. They were afraid of those societal consequences, where now they have parades for it.
If you tie in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 3 talks about those who practice after their lust and that kind of stuff are children of wrath, or those who are deserving of God's wrath. I think what you were saying earlier is correct, that this is more talking about God's wrath than anything else.
Yeah.
But certainly how God's wrath plays out, it may be that he's a part of that, but definitely I think it's in the immediate context, it is God's wrath he's talking about.
Yes. And the only reason I mentioned that is because I've heard that statement made before,
Yeah.
and people tying that, not necessarily within the church, but in
Yes.
societal discussions that, well, that's why AIDS happened, and they quote a verse like this, and I think that's a stretch. While it may be a physical consequence, there's physical consequences to drinking and driving, and all other types of sin. Let's go ahead and we'll read verses 28 through the end of the chapter, and then we'll come back and we'll make some comments on those. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. Now, if we back up, verse 28 kind of continues the thought that we've seen it twice already, where he gave them over to do the things that they chose to do. That doesn't mean he's okay with it. It doesn't mean he made them that way. It means they chose to do this. That was what was in their heart.
The American Standard says they've refused to know God or have God in their heart.
Yeah.
So it puts it back on the individual. God didn't cause them to do that.
Right. God didn't cause it.
We do that.
The devil didn't make them do it. They chose to do this. But then he goes in verse 29 and down through 31. He makes this list of sins, and some of them just jump right out at you. They're obviously sin. And there's no question about it. Do we sometimes, even as Christians, but certainly as mankind, do we tend to categorize sin by severity?
Yes.
I've looked at some verses, and I don't have them right now off the top of my head, where God does refer to some things as being worse than others. Some things are an abomination to God. So I won't say that God doesn't see differences in severity, but I think also there are differences in severity of the natural consequences of some sins. And I think we can understand that clearly. Some of these we could pull out: sexual immorality, wickedness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder. It's pretty easy to, haters of God in verse 30, violent, inventors of evil things. Those jump out at us as these are obviously wrong. Do you have something different?
You have New King James?
Yeah.
And at right at the end of verse 29, yours says whisperers, I think.
Yes.
And here in the ESV says gossips.
Gossips.
And that's what, I mean,
Yeah.
I just clarifying that
Yeah.
right in the middle of all this stuff that we
Yes.
look as bad,
Yeah.
gossip is right there.
Right. So I plucked out some that are obviously terrible, but if we go back in, kind of sprinkled throughout are some that we, even ourselves, would probably
Yeah.
put farther down the list of how severe they are. Have any of us ever been untrustworthy? Ever?
Proud, it seems to be.
Have any of us ever been proud or boasting? Have we ever been unloving or unforgiving? Those things are all mixed in the same group with murder, sexual immorality. So I think from that standpoint, we can kind of see, well, what Paul's telling those in Rome is, all of these sins are going to can cause you to lose your soul. But I think, let's go back and read verse 32 again. Who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death. So the people that practice the things above are deserving of death. That includes us, because we all just said we have done some of these things. We are deserving of spiritual death.
But the difference is it says practice.
Right.
We're all gonna mess up as
Right.
long as we're not practicing that.
Sure, we're not instantly sentenced to death because we make a mistake.
Right.
But at some point in our lives, we realized, I have been practicing these things.
Yeah.
I am deserving of death. I need to fix that. I need to repent, and I need to be baptized and become one of his children so that those sins are washed away, so they're gone. Does that mean we'll never do another one of these again? No, it doesn't. We'll make mistakes. And those are repairable.
Another one in there is disobedient to parents. We don't look at that as something so vile or bad, but usually a child that continues to be disobedient to parents winds up being disobedient to authority,
Yes.
and a lot of bad things happen. So it seems like something kind of innocent that kids do, but yet it's dangerous.
It is, and you're right, because they lack the respect for the parent, and that turns into lack of respect for the next person in authority, and the next person in authority, or any authority for that matter. And those are the kids that end up being in trouble with the law eventually. And sometimes the root cause of that isn't the child choosing to be disobedient to the parent, but the parent not choosing to be the parent. That's where the problem started. Parents not being the parent will quickly create children that are disobedient to parents as they get older. So while he here is referring to the disobedience of parents, that may not always be the root cause or where it began. But one thing I'd like us to note as he closes out in verse 32, so he listed all these sins in the last 3 verses, said, who knowing the righteous judgment of God and those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. That should be frightening to us as Christians, that do I catch myself approving of some of these things? I would never participate in them. But it doesn't really bother me that much. If they do it,
It's their problem.
that's their choice. God gave them the choice. That's their problem. And we could probably even take this a step further as far as a warning to us as Christians. We see things in our society happening and they just become normal. And we're not bothered by them anymore. We use the example of homosexuality on TV. When that comes on TV now in a show, it doesn't surprise me. As a kid, it's kind of shocking. It's on TV so much, it's not surprising anymore. That's not good.
Deconditioning.
That we've been deconditioned to be shocked by sin. And not that I don't recognize it instantly and think, that's sinful. Why do they promote it? But I'm not surprised anymore. So how many other things are subtly creeping into our society and into our entertainment, all around us, that we're not bothered by anymore or surprised by anymore? There are so many, and not to get political, but in our society, there's so many that are pushing some of these agendas to promote these things. Whether it's homosexuality, whether it's abortion, whether it's sex changes for transgender, those things are hot topics in our society today. And those are being pushed at society as if you need to accept this.
Well, just current, Trump just said men can't compete, transgender men can't compete in women's sport, and there's so much protest over that.
Yes.
Oh, it's not fair.
Yes.
Not
So-
fair to the men?
And it's the loud minority
Trump will.
trying to make that the societal norm now. Where this morning, I think we could even, I'm not trying to make this verse say more than it is, but when it talks about those who approve of the ones who practice those things, when there are politicians who are pushing those agendas and saying, you need to accept this, I can't tell them what to say, but I have a say in who's in that seat. So for us as Christians, we need to be careful who we choose to put in certain seats. We only have one choice, each of us does. But I still have a say in who I try to promote to certain political positions. And if I know someone is going to push this agenda and I say, I vote for them, have I not just started the ball rolling to help them approve of these things, and so doing maybe done it myself? That's my personal feeling. I'm not saying that's a scriptural teaching, but I'm saying it's something we need to think about as Christians, being careful of the people we choose to be in positions of power when we know they promote sinful things. I think that's our responsibility as free citizens that have a vote, to be aware of those things. I'm not saying that's what I think Paul was getting at in verse 32 directly. We need to be mindful that if we don't speak out against something, we're going along with it. We're approving of it. So we need to be willing to stand for truth and not just sit back and let things happen that we know are sinful and say nothing. I've run over my time a little bit and taken a couple minutes from Josh, so I'll be done, and appreciate everyone's comments and patience with jumping to a new topic. We'll let Jeff go back to where he left off when he gets back.